Welcome to Trial Lawyer Prep, where you learn how to better connect with clients and juries, gather up strategies for persuasion, and learn how to use focus groups along the way. I'm your host, Elizabeth Larrick, and let's dive into a new episode. I want to call you back to a discussion we had in an episode a few months back, trial strategy versus trial tactics, and how lawyers can confuse the two. In this episode, we are going to dive into specific examples of a trial tactic versus a trial strategy. They're very similar in nature, very persuasive, but they can also get mixed up because they are so close. So we are going to talk about timelines and sequencing here today. Let's dig into what it is, how they're different, how we can use them both, and when to use them. So you have likely heard of a timeline. These are not new things that we are talking about. Rather, what I want to talk about very specifically is how to use them, knowing what they are and what they are not, to the best advantage that we have. So think of a timeline as a curated visual picture of the case, key events in chronological order that gives the viewer, the audience, the whole picture of the case in a glance. It helps lawyers stay organized, everyone on the team is on track, and helps your jurors understand fast. Now, you've probably used a medical timeline before, and that is not what we are talking about here, although it is the same thing, right? It's chronological order of treatment. But what we're talking about here for this is the case timeline. And so it's very specific, essential events and not everything on the timeline. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, a timeline is your tool. It's our tactic that we are going to use to get everyone oriented. Now, not every trial lawyer works with a timeline or wants to use one at trial. I know very successful lawyers who never use a timeline. I personally really love a timeline. I think organizing facts, being able to pinpoint the start and the end for everyone involved is very helpful and very persuasive. So I use them extensively in my focus group work, in my witness prep work. I just love a timeline, but not everybody does, and that's okay. Let's talk a little bit about how I use a timeline for my clients. For my advanced or premium focus group clients, I actually create a timeline for you in PowerPoint and give it to you as part of the preparation. And for our basic one-issue focus groups, again, I help you create a timeline so that we can get that in front of the focus group quickly and then get to the feedback. So we have to work fast in our focus groups. And so that's why I think a timeline is very helpful, because you then have to pick what you want on it to test it. And so it helps our focus group participants get a quick picture of what's going on and get to that feedback. If you're curious about a basic one-issue focus group, how it works, including how I help you create a timeline so that you can get better juror feedback, book a free consultation with the link in the show notes. So, how is sequencing different? Because again, sequencing is an order of events. Sequencing, what we're talking about here as a trial strategy, is obviously picking what goes first and then the rest of the path, what goes second. That overall map of how you're laying out the information, the evidence that leads the jury to your verdict, or if you're in mediation, leads your audience to your number, your conclusion. So this sequencing is really going to tell you what is happening, exactly how they want them to take it in. What is that route they're going to have? A timeline could just be one stop along the way, right? So think of your timeline, right, as your facts, but you're sequencing more about larger pieces of evidence and a little bit more on persuasion, although they're both persuasive. So your sequencing may be a key document. Your sequencing could then be a particular witness at a particular time. maybe then a demonstrative that goes next. So it's really a very deliberate path that you are taking your audience on. So let me give you an example from our last episode where we talked about live witnesses versus deposition clips. I talked about an example where the employment lawyer knew that the key documents were the HR notes, and she knew they had to go first. She knew that sequencing. She knew the primacy of those particular documents. That's what we're talking about here, is being able to know what evidence is so essential for your audience to know first, that you're doing that deliberately. And unlike a timeline, right, where you don't have to necessarily use one in a case, you are 100% going to use sequencing in a case. And sequencing is being intentional about how that evidence comes in. It can be done unintentionally, and that's really where things can get squirrely and people don't understand how the juries or their audience could get sideways when they've given them information. How you give it to them is very important. So think of your timeline as a tool, your sequencing as your map. You can win without the tool, but you can't win without the map. So knowing those two things and a little bit the differences of both, I want to talk about why they work, a little bit about the brain science so that you can have a little bit better idea about when maybe to use it, which is going to come here shortly in our episode here. So why do timelines work? Overall, we know through cognitive science and research that human brains will take the first thing and assume it's the first thing that happened in time, right? So they're just going to take that as the start point and just assume. And that gets our brains confused when then more events are added in, especially when they're out of order. It really makes our brains do a lot of extra work to figure out, whoa, what is the order of what's going on? So let's take an opening statement, for example. Think about a recent opening statement. Maybe you've heard, maybe you haven't. I hear a lot where the lawyer starts down a line of information, but then stops and wants you to go back in time, either before or after, and then they jump back and they just get lost, right? Like you can see the looks on their face, they're lost. That's what we're talking about here, where if you're trying to tell a story and you're jumping around, right, you're going to lose the brain. It's going to get very fragmented for our listeners. And that's where that timeline can come in, where you're giving them at a glance a very simplified, ordered, clean way to see the entire picture, right? Brains want to see all of it in one glance, right? And this is where, again, if we're putting too many things on our timeline, that just loses the whole point of persuasion. And again, the whole point's of giving everything at a glance. So they've also looked at research where on event boundaries show that every time a narrative shifts in time, like we talked about, shifting forward, shifting backward, the listener actually loses access to the information they've learned before, right? So when we have testimony, think about that jumps around out of order. We have opening statements that jump around out of order, they get lost, right? So you could even think about there are cases where we have separate timelines depending on where we are in our sequence. So think then about an example of a trucking case. You may have a hiring timeline. You may have a training timeline. You may have a supervision timeline. But if you put all of those together, it would be a very jumbled up timeline, and they would lose the specific things that you wanted to necessarily highlight. So you could have separate timelines depending on what's going on, but overall you just want to make sure you're curating all of your timelines because it gives the brain simplicity, order, and organization it doesn't have to work for, and it loves it. So then let's talk then a little about sequencing, and that falls into one of my favorite categories of primacy, right? What goes first is given more importance. But it also taps into the brain can't hold on to everything. And we've talked about this as well, maybe 3 to 5 things for our short-term memory. That's it. And then it's gone, right? So this is where when we think of sequencing, we're trying to think of the top few things that need to come first and frequently, right? So primacy and recency. And that helps then with our cognitive overload and things don't get lost. So when we unintentionally throw our evidence at the jury, unintentionally throw maybe witnesses out of order, it's very difficult then where to place them in the overall, and sometimes it just gets lost, right? So this is where the sequencing of all the information is how to help our working memory, right? How to commit things to our working memory. Those are things, again, we're going to tell them oftenly and first. So when do you use these things? When do you use our tool and when do you use our strategy, right? Well, we've already said sequencing should be a part of everything when you're thinking mediation and trial. That's where our sequencing comes in. But I also want you to think about your timeline as a tool to help you and your team stay organized through the entire case. So I always encourage people to start a timeline early, right? And think of it as a case timeline. Try to get that medical timeline. That's a whole different situation here. Here's where it can get a little squirrely is a lot of times lawyers want to add every single event on your timeline, and then it's just this giant document. It's not really helpful. That's where coming into focus groups will significantly help you curate that case timeline into those essential story events where we know where do we start and where do we end. And having it go back to focus groups several different times really then helps you revise and know, okay, here are the top, key events, 5 events. How far back in time do we need to go? That way they get the full picture of the case in one glance. And then also overall, right, your overarching focus groups, even if you're not doing a timeline, they're going to tell you what are the key documents, the key witnesses, the key events, the key facts. That's where the sequencing comes in, where you're doing the overarching 30,000-foot view of sequencing and ordering the information to bring them down the path of the conclusion that you want. So let's put this all together for you because we've talked about this kind of abstractly. So I want to give you an example about a medical malpractice case from a few years back, where there was a patient who, over a course of 3 months, went to 3 separate ERs, multiple times, by the way. There's 3 different ERs, and was having constant headaches and was slowly going blind. Eventually does go blind. And we used our focus groups to figure out, number one, a timeline. We knew this was so much information to put on a timeline, and we needed to know what were the key events for causation when we had this many defendants, these many events. But then we also needed to know what really had to go first to then help them with this timeline. And what we discovered was the medical records, but very specifically the test results. So on the very first visit for this patient, a test was run, and the results came back after the patient was let out of the hospital. But the patient was never called, and the medical results never went to the file. That then triggered repeating records for each additional visit with the wrong information. So we learned through the course of 5+ focus groups, I think we even did another one, 6 focus groups, we learned that the timeline was an essential tool, but the key piece of evidence, the sequencing we need, was the wrong test results had to be first. And then what we knew from our timeline was that the repeating wrong information had to go with each ER visit, right? That was going to be key for the audience to know, oh my gosh, if this one thing had gone right and they had that information before they got to the timeline. So that's where we had put together, right, learning the key things that needed to go, and then the order of them. They had to have that wrong test result before they saw the timeline for it all to kind of make sense. You know what I mean? That had to come first. So, okay, long story short. Successful result in that case, a confidential settlement that we can't talk about over here, but very well done focus groups to help us get to a successful conclusion on that case. All right, let's recap. So a timeline is a tactic. It's a tool. I do think that they're essential. Not everybody does, and that's okay. The science tells us that our brains are wired to assume what we hear first happened first. So we're wired for a chronological order here. And when it comes out of order, our brains get confused. Timelines give you the power to choose the start event and the end event. They give you the power to show the picture of the entire story of the case on one clean, curated piece of paper or slide, if you will. Sequencing is that strategy. It's the overall map. And this science is just a little bit different in the sense that we talk about working memory and primacy, right? We know that we can hold too many different things at a time. And if we narrow it down, what's most important, right, goes first. And if we add more in there, if we have too many key events and key documents, it just gets lost. All of it together, we overload our memory. So we want to make sure we use our focus groups to narrow down what are our key documents, key events, even key witnesses here. So timelines work with how jurors think. Sequencing works on how jurors remember and how they place importance on the first things as well. You need both. And that's how we want you to be persuasive. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Until next time, keep prepping to win.